Good morning and a very warm welcome to our distinguished panel of CA Anil Bhandari, Chairman, Valuation Standard Board, CA MP Vijay Kumar, Vice Chairman, Valuation Standard Board. Our guest speaker for today, Rajan Vadhavan, who is a registered valuer, and none other than Debajyoti Ray Chaudhary ji, who is the Chief General Manager, IBBI, and has been a great supporter for the cause of the growth of the valuation profession. In fact, we have a very interesting topic today, which is on the observations, the learnings from the observations of peer review on the valuation reports. Now, the regulatory arbitrage is already there. We have Section 247 under the Companies Act, which covers the valuation by the registered valuers, meaning thereby that the profession of valuer is a regulated one. And again, we have the registered valuers and valuation rules 2017, which talks of specified asset classes, and good amount of journey has been traveled by the profession in these last 3.5 years in stabilization of the valuation ecosystem. Now, after that, we have the guidelines on use of caveats, limitations, and disclaimers. And as the theme itself suggests, the limitations which the profession, the valuers are facing, that should not be limiting the purpose or the responsibility in the valuation report. So the entire web has been constructed in which the ecosystem, how the valuation is to take place, the regulatory construct is very clear. Now, what distinguishes a profession from a mere avocation is its ability to abide by the standards, maintain quality, and being subjected to discipline. We have a couple of rounds of peer review on the valuation report done in last 2 years, and given a sneak peek, I think some of the observations are very mundane but yet very specific. And I think we'll have a great session today with the regulator himself coming here, and he'll try to demystify as to what is the expectation of the regulator as to the entire subject matter of the valuation and the valuation report and the role of the RVOs in such a context. With these words, I welcome this panel again. Debjyoti Roy Chaudhary ji, Rajan Vadhavan ji, the Chairman and Vice Chairman, and my colleague Sarika Singhal on the Valuation Standard Board. Over to you, C. Anil Bhandari ji, for carrying forward the process.
So again, a very warm good morning to all of you, our viewers. Thank you, Rakesh ji. Welcome again to this Sunday with valuation experts. I warmly welcome Debajyoti Chaudhary ji on this panel today. I think it's going to be very exciting, especially for me, to hear your views on the peer review. At the same time, I welcome Rajan ji, our guest today. Of course, he has been with us before on Sundays with Valuation Experts, and I think we started our series with him, and I think it was fantastic or fantabulous. And of course, we have MPV here, my colleague, who is the Vice Chairman for the Valuation Standards Board. And thank you, Sarika, as usual, for stitching this together. Without taking too much time, I believe that this is likely to be a very important session today because, like a school teacher, I think we have two of our guests here who are likely to, direct us in the right direction in terms of issues that they would have found, challenges that they would have seen, and also, of course, comment on the quality of the reports that they would have probably seen from the peer review. So I think this is likely to be a very good session. My request to all our members today is raise as many questions as possible. We've been having fantastic rounds of questions in the last several Sundays. I think we've received almost more than 200 questions, and we have more than 3,000, 4,000 members who are constantly glued in here. So without wasting too much time, I would request MPV to take over this session. And of course, during the course of the session, we will start engaging as we usually do. So I think the episode and the series still continue. As I keep saying every Sunday, that this looks like a Netflix series, and I think we should make it as interesting as possible. So Thank you, everybody. And on to you, MPV, for us to start this session.
Thanks a lot, Anil, and very, very hearty welcome to Mr. Debjyoti Rai Chaudhary and Rajan Vadwan. Debjyoti has been a very strong well-wisher of the Institute, the IIIPI, and the ICAR-WIBO. He's, in fact, my interaction with him is almost about 2 years, and on 2 specific occasions where I had detailed interactions with him, I found him to be extremely pragmatic to the ground realities and committed to the cause of building the profession. And as you know, Anil, we all see peer review more as a mechanism for quality improvement rather than for hanging people. And who better than Chaudhary ji himself, who has so much understanding of the profession to guide us on this. Debjyoti, welcome once again. Sincere thanks to you for accepting our invite and being there for us always. And Rajan, thanks for joining us again this Sunday too. Debjyoti, just to begin with, some opening remarks from you with reference to the topic of peer review and a little context setting on what is the need for having a peer review. As chartered accountants, we have an understanding, but from the valuation profession perspective, your thoughts will be extremely welcome.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Vijay Kumar. And first of all, I feel that this idea of having this Sunday morning sessions are very good. It goes along with your branch. As Mr. Bhandari said, it's like a Netflix series. So it can rather well go with your Sunday morning branch. And I think this, learning in an informal atmosphere, it makes it fun, and it also, makes it very effective. Now, the IBC ecosystem has produced two babies. I mean, valuation is, of course, has been there for times immemorial, but I would say the registered valuer profession is a product of the IBC. So it has produced 2 babies, and both of them and the ecosystem are equally dear to me. So as if, like today morning, I'm doing a session on evaluation, and today evening, I'm doing a session on the insolvency profession, a seminar on insolvency profession. So, I have to divide my time equally between these 2 professions because these 2 professions are equally dear to me. Now, before this, coming to this peer review, way we thought of it, I'll just give you a background as to, what went about implementation of the company's registered valuer and valuation rules 2017. Broadly, we would be aware that in October 17, the architecture was in place, and we had very stiff timelines because the rules then stated that existing valuers could, do valuations only till 31st March 2018. So we had roughly around 4-5 months to have the entire architecture in place. As we know, with the way the authority, as we call in the rules, does most things is through way of public consultation. So those 4-5 months were extremely busy for us. We did a series of consultations because a number of things, rules gave the broad framework, but number of things had to be finalized. One is, what would be the syllabus for the exam? Then some with their various groups, of course, they wanted a waiver for the exam. They said, no, I'm doing valuation for, years and years. Why do you need to appear for the exam? And of course, there are a lot of concerns. Many people said, this, I don't fit into this qualification. What do I do? Can I not, does my profession come to an end? So all those fears, all those concerns had to be allayed. We did a number of roundtables. We had a lot of feedback. We finalized the syllabus, and on 31st March 18, the date when this the registered valuers had to come into force, we launched the exam. That was a major achievement because for exam also we had to, do the syllabus for the exam. We had to have arrangements in place for doing the exam. And then we also need to have the ecosystem, the RVOs. In fact, again, I would acknowledge ICI RVO also. It set up one of the, RVOs, because without an RVO, you cannot have a registered valuer, because rules mandate that you have to first get enrolled with an RVO, and then the other things follow. So the entire ecosystem was in place, and 31st March 18, the D-date for this, the valuation rules to come into effect. In fact, the rules were slightly, in fact, it's quite strict in the sense that after 31st March 18, nobody could do the profession unless they were, registered as per the rules. Subsequently, of course, as I will, I'll come to that, there was a couple of extensions. So when we launched this, the registered valuer, the profession, I would say it's a profession, although we launched on 31st March 18, but then many people were kind of left out. Many people did not, their existing professional qualification, as per that professional qualification, they did not fit in. So there were a lot of concerns, and all stakeholders, all authorities, the authority, IBBI, the government, they were all responsive to these concerns. So the dialogue continued, although the rules were implemented from 31st March 18, but it did not become mandatory till much later. There were two extensions, first till 30th September and then till 31st January. The rules did not become mandatory till then. The process of consultation continued to all stakeholders. Now, I personally believe any reform, it can be successful if there are two aspects are taken into account. One, it should be least disruptive to existing stakeholders. You have to take them along. If you see the aborted valuation rules of 2008, we learned from that. We knew that many valuer organizations have been there for years and years. In fact, the first valuer organization was set up, the formal organization was set up in 1968. They recently completed the Golden Jubilee. So valuation has a long history in India. Now, all of a sudden, you cannot say that whatever you've done 50 years of no use. So you cannot start with a clean slate. You have to take all stakeholders along. All stakeholders should be convinced that there's a need for reform. There's a need to move to a new system. So that was a philosophy adopted. And finally, I would say with great satisfaction, in November sometime in 2018, the amendment in the rules came along, and by and large, it satisfied it. It addressed the concerns of a large segment of the stakeholders. So we can say from November 2018, the rules were stabilized. The rules were broadly gained acceptance, and from 31st January, after 31st January, nobody could do a valuation unless he was registered under the rules. So that was a history, and a lot of work went to ensure that the new rules broadly gained acceptance, and broadly everyone who was eligible under the old system were at least eligible to be a registered valuer under the new rules. I think that was a major reason why it was successful, and it broadly gained acceptance. But one issue I must like to say is that although there were a lot of discussions, we did make a lot of concessions, but on one area we said no compromise. That is the kind of line we drew, and that was the valuation exam. We said no, there will be no exemption to the valuation exam. Why? Because India is a large country. It is also a diverse country. There are standards of education institutions, standards of degrees awarded by various colleges, universities, they are disparate. So we need to have one common standards. So that is one, one issue, one aspect in the valuation rules, which we said there would be no compromise, and exam will need to be given by everyone who desired to practice as a registered valuer under the rules. So that was the broad, history of the rules. I thought I'll give this background so that all stakeholders, all your listeners are aware that the efforts to make this, this new model, this reform successful. Because, and this is very important, of course, I'll, maybe later on, if time permits, I'll dwell on this, the further reform, because, like I said, reform cannot be, if you have a totally disruptive reform, it'll be difficult to, gain acceptance. So reform has to be one, you have to take existing stakeholders along, and then it should be step by step, but keeping the overall objective of the rules of good valuation into account. So that was the background. Now I'll come to what is peer review. Broadly, peer review, I think most people are aware. There are, in fact, two aspects. There's a third aspect, that is my personal opinion. So the two aspects which are generally associated with peer review is one, it is done by peers. So it is done in a friendly manner. And the second aspect is that it has no regulatory sanction. So whatever, comes out of it, it is for learning purposes. No formal action follows as a result of it. So now I'll add my dimension to this. My dimension is that it is a process of two-way learning. It is not a process of one-way learning. It is a process of two-way learning. So even a peer reviewer can learn from what is being done. In fact, when we did this peer review, one issue which came up was how do we compensate our peer reviews? Now, we will not get into that. We will ask the RVOs to have a policy peer review, and they can very well provide for this, and we can we will not get into it. It's up to RVOs to take a decision on it. But my personal view is that it is a process of mutual learning. Even the peer reviewer can also learn from the peer reviews which he has done, because it is often said the eye cannot see itself except by reflection. So even if he is a good valuer, he will always benefit if a peer, and he's not an interest party, if a peer has some observations on this. And finally, one more issue I would like to tell you is that peer review, it is the first stage. I'm not saying there's going to be a second stage, but there may be a second stage. What is that second stage? As I said, peer review is an informal process with no, regulatory sanction. So if something comes out, it is for only learning purposes. But peer review for valuation, it could be a first step to a formal inspection with all incident consequences. So peer review, I'm not saying it shall be, but I'm saying that it may be a precursor to formal inspection with all its incident consequences. We want all our registered values to be prepared for that. In fact, the RVOs have already been given a broad indication that please make preparations for inspection of the RVs. So it may be a precursor for the formal inspection, but as of now, peer review as it stands it is only for learning purposes and to meet the overarching objective of the rules, to have a good valuation report which presents a good picture for all the stakeholders who use the valuation reports. I think I've spoken quite a bit. I'll stop here.
I think MPV, this is fantastic. I think the idea of peer review, of course, is fantastic. My request to Chaudhary ji will be that before we get into the era of traffic lights and signals, as a regulator, maybe you would probably want to start with making peer review a mandatory function within the RVO, just as ICAI does a peer review and then pronounces a firm to be peer reviewed. And then maybe we start the formal methodology of inspection, if at all. As MPV knows, I'm a great fan of having roads without signals. So that's the best way to do it if all of us are at that level. And maybe another idea could be in terms of payments that you spoke about. Maybe a peer reviewer could be a compulsory requirement under a CP requirement, because everybody needs to learn, like you said. It's a learning on both the sides. So maybe for the first 1 or 2 years, we could probably look at something like that as well. But anyway, we'll keep that aside for another day for discussion. But I think it's a fantastic journey. We appreciate the fact that the entire team at IBBI has worked very hard for both IBC as well as the valuation standards and the setup of the RVOs and all of that. A lot goes into it. It's not an easy job. And thank you so much for taking the entire nation of the country to this stage where I think we are very, very well organized. And I think we are geared up to look at the next 10 years where all of this is likely to be very interesting. And of course, challenges come up when the size really goes up. So I just wanted to thank you on that. And of course, back to MPV.
Yeah, thank you. It's my pleasure.
Debjyoti ji, you actually mentioned it's a personal view that the peer reviewer also learns. But let me share with you, at the institute, when we do the peer review for audit functions, it is actually treated as one of the targeted outcomes that the reviewer should also become qualitatively better, because he is also doing work elsewhere, doing the same audit. And just an extension of that, Debjyoti, we also have frequent formal interactions with these reviewers, where we get feedback on areas where we have to improve our regulatory framework. We have to add to the learning competency developments which we need to do. So there's lots of advantages from a peer review process. And just like you, I would also encourage everyone to embrace peer review, welcome quality peer review and not a checkbox, because it's an excellent process for improving quality. And Debjyoti, I just want to make an observation on your opening remarks. I like that observation. There's two kids out of the same one. It's almost like twins, Twins are normally born with 2 minutes gap. Probably here they were born with 2 years gap. Maybe they'll live much, much longer. But so rightly said. And what I loved most, and just for the benefit of members, because many of us, until we experience working with regulators, have a particular view. And when you start working with regulators, you actually start understanding their perspective and work in that direction. In fact, your 3 key messages, I'm sure everybody would have registered. One was the fact that you so beautifully said, and you said it twice, that reforms have to be less disruptive and it should be step by step. I think it adds to the confidence of everybody who is listening to you now. And second thing which you had mentioned was that we need to embrace all the existing stakeholders. We just can't leave out somebody and start something. It's so very assuring, and very happy that we have professionals like you leading the body. You can just go one step forward on the discussion, Mr. Debjyoti. See, we have a peer review for the registered valuer organizations, how they are functioning, and a peer review of the registered valuers. So what exactly is the outcome which we are targeting in each of these? You did briefly indicate in your previous one that it's more informal one, quality improvement. Can you elaborate that a little more, so that when people do the work or expose themselves for peer review, they can meet the objective of the regulator?
So let me just clarify that as of now, RVOs are subject to formal inspection.
Okay.
So even Sarika is there. So even this ICAI RVO was subject to formal inspection. So RVOs are not subject to peer review.
Okay.
So as of now, RVOs are subject to
formal
inspection. But as of now, the peer review is done only for the RVs. But yes, we take the RVOs along with whatever initiative. So even the peer review mechanism is done closely with the RVOs. The way the IBC is and the rules are, if you see, the RVOs and is also modeled similar to that of the insolvency professional. So it is a two-tier regulatory architecture, and the IPS and the RVOs are they're called the frontline regulators, because they are supposed to be actually they are supposed to have the ears on the ground. They are supposed to be actually in touch, because they are interacting with much lesser members, and plus the members actually enroll with them, so they have more of ownership with the members. So that's why they're called the frontline regulators. So that's why whatever initiatives we do, it is always in association with the IPS if it's insolvency professional, and the RVOs if it is the matter as far as valuation is concerned. So if you see the peer review, so that is why it is done closely in association with the RVOs. The understanding, of course, because they are the persons who have the ear on the ground. They are actually in touch with the members. They have ownership of the members. So peer review is done in close association with the RVOs, but essentially peer review is done for their registered valuer members. And as far as the RVOs are concerned, they are in any case subject to a formal inspection on a case-to-case basis. Every year we identify some RVOs and they are subject to case-to-case inspection. And just to sort of expand this point about association with all stakeholders. So whatever we do, it is in association with the stakeholders, because like I said, they are the people who have the eyes on the ground, or at least they are supposed to have the eyes on the ground. They are supposed to have ownership of their members. So even if you see the guidelines on caveats, limitations, disclosures, so these have been, of course, a committee was formed and we have one of the esteemed members in this panel. But feedback was obtained from all the RVOs, whatever comments, whatever observations which they had based on discussion with the members, all these were considered. And even as we speak, I would say that these guidelines are also being further amended. In fact, if you see whatever we do from the board side or from the authority side, we always believe that it is not final. Nothing is final. We are responsive. We like to be seen as responsive regulators. A regulator has to take into concerns the market requirements, the change in market dynamics. So whatever we do, these are not final. We always take feedback. In fact, in all our regulations, it is a standing feature. From 1st April to 31st December, any stakeholder can give feedback on the regulations. So, and the rules are slightly different because rules are monitored directly by ministry. But whatever we do, for example, the guidelines. So guidelines also, there was a feedback that there could be further improvement on these guidelines. So all those feedback we have taken cognizance of, and we have run it through the RVOs. RVOs have given the comments, and so maybe in a month or so we'll have these revised guidelines in place. Revised guidelines to take into account, change in market dynamics, something which we may not have considered on the earlier occasions. So all those things are being taken care of through the feedback mechanism with the RVOs. So just to sum up, RVOs are a very important part of the ecosystem because they are the frontline regulators, and that's why they have a much more important responsibility, and that's why they are subject to a formal inspection by the authority.
Okay. Very helpful, Debjyoti. Rajan, if I can take the benefit of your experience as a registered valuer, and also the fact that you interact very closely with both ICAI RVO and through ICAI RVO with IBBI. When a peer review is about to begin, what should be the approach by the valuer? What is the extent of preparedness he should have? What is the precautions he should take or get ready for an effective peer review to be done? As Ms. Devjyoti also mentioned, the idea is to improve quality. So how does somebody get prepared for that?
Yeah, thanks, MPV. It's a very relevant question, and having interacted both with while working for ICAI RVO, as well as when we were presenting the findings to IBBI on the peer review outcomes, what came out of the review of this thing. The key things, which we felt, and there's been a tremendous improvement or change in the first time when we conducted the peer review versus the second time which we conducted it. So like in 20 vis-a-vis 21, the issue which we faced was a lot of people got prepared of certain things which need to be a part of the report or their listing. That we felt was a very good learning experience. So hence the findings which came out of the first peer review findings, added to that the concept paper which was brought out by ICAI RVO, the interaction which happened at the ICAI office itself, where all the RVO members were also there. We could also learn, like peer review, what Devjyoti ji and everyone was talking about was about a person who's reviewing and someone's work. But over there, when the exchange of ideas amongst the RVOs also happened, you could, pick up certain things from there also. That these are certain improvements or certain things which another RVO should look at, or a reviewer should also look at. So to give you an example, and ICAI, we got a very already established, laid out mechanism when we are carrying out a peer review. Like it can be an unknown person who cannot directly get in touch, redacted reports and all that. So initially in the first lot, those kind of things were there, that the reports came out having the name of the person who's done it or the organization who's done it. But when all those things were pointed out, next time all those things were taken care of. So even the reviewer could not get in touch with someone. He was doing it on a blind way, right? In that sense, his findings were presented, and then RVO or IBBI, whatever, who wants to take it forward now, if there is a next step going forward, that it becomes also a mechanism of further regulation. The findings which are there by the peer reviewed, they act as a base on which an investigation or anything or a review of the working papers can be done. So the important thing which we had kept in mind during the first two from ICAI RVO side, I would say that was, we had put a lot of emphasis on what should be disclosed out in the report and what should not be disclosed out in the report. And keeping in mind the standards or the expected governance in this thing. Especially for a listed company, we said, forward-looking statements, even SEBI doesn't permit them. They should never be brought out because people can take position on the basis of the projections which are shown out. Those are certain things which are very sensitive, and if you're doing evaluation for a minority, how it should get handled. But certain very basic information about, the purpose of valuation, the standard of value, the premise of value, all those things, the person who's done the valuation, so that there is an accountability over there. His name, his team members, and the contact, and all those, what valuation standard he's followed. Has he not adopted a process, or has he not adopted an approach? And if not, has he disclosed why he's not approached it? All those things are covered. So we tried, and I would just share my experience. So like when the first time we did it, we laid out a framework that this is the minimum thing which should be there in a report. We were not interacting with the person who's done the report, right? At that point, because it was like a redacted report has come to you. Now you please provide your feedback. taking into account whatever rules and guidelines which have been specified or the standard which have been put up. So we standardized in that sense a format internally, which is going to be a dynamic. Does the report address all these things? And then therefrom we evolved further. So that is what this thing, and that's the beauty about working with both IBBI and ICI is.
Rajanji, if I'm sorry to interject, but is there a framework that we have established for our members in terms of a quality framework? Do we have something like a quality framework? I mean, do I know already what I'm expected to do? Of course, I know from standards what I'm supposed to do, which is one part of it.
So we are going from two things which we are using as a base. One is the standards which are already which have been put out that they outline, and as a valuer or as even a chartered accountant, if I'm doing a valuation, I am required to follow those standards. So my output is supposed to have that kind of a quality, right? Or it should have those minimum or maximum disclosures in this thing. Has those aspects been covered in that report is how we used it. So we framed out 8 or 10 questions around it.
Okay.
In each report, we looked at it. This was for our internal working, and I'm sharing from that perspective. That's how we approached it. And then we also looked at what IBBI and the various things which have come out, whether it's a guideline on caveats and all that, they all talk about, what a good report or what good working paper should be maintained in certain ways.
Right.
While in this case, we were not getting into any working papers, or we were not reviewing, or we were not getting into any discussion on the judgment which a valuer has applied. We're not getting into that bit. But is the report self-sufficient in certain ways that it can go? And if required, he can provide the necessary papers even later, right?
So would it be right to say that the first peer reviews that we have conducted is more based on what is the expected result that somebody is trying to articulate in a report, and does it have the minimum requirements that one should put in a valuation report?
Yes.
Whether one has gone forward and done some reviews, some testing of the assumptions, that is not a part at this point in time. But whether he's able to, put all of those neatly in the report, that has been the expectation in the first round. Is that, Would that be right?
That'll be right. And like I would say, I saw a tremendous, if you take a look at the findings and as a valuation, the findings of the first peer review, which was done, and the second, which was done, and I can talk about it, and we pushed that out, also printed those out, the peer review findings, right? It's there on our site at ICI RVO site. You can see the change in terms of, it's clearly articulated also there, right? That there was so much of improvement which was seen in terms of transparency and people addressing.
No, I think there's no doubt, Rajanji, that all of these processes eventually lead to maturity and eventually lead to quality and credibility. So I think there's no doubt. But in order to, of course, again, in the interest of time that we have, in order to, and sorry, MPV, I'm because sometimes when questions come to my mind, I'm sorry I can't hold them. Because you remember that this is my incremental learning session that I have every Sunday. I would want to pose one to Chaudhary is, what are the 3 most important things that you would be worried about in terms of registered valuers executing their function? Any 3 things that you would be worried about, that these 3 things are something that every registered valuer should keep in mind, should do for us to run this function very, very well, for you as a regulator to be very comfortable that this function is run in the nation appropriately as it should be run.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Bhandari. Now, I think the first thing which comes to my mind, of course, is that we have issued these guidelines, and again, now since I'm on this point of these guidelines, and I just like to stress on one part, and there's a common understanding or misunderstanding that these guidelines are kind of only guidance, it's not mandatory. But as we've mentioned clearly in the approach to the guidelines, that yes, it is mandatory for all registered valuers to comply with this. And if you see, I'll just go back a bit and give you the genesis of this, how these guidelines came about.
I'm sorry, Chaudhary, while I'm very sorry about this, and while we will go through that challenge of how it's come,
Yeah.
just because we have a
So
lot
the
of
three
people
things.
here,
Okay.
as a message,
All
very
right.
important coming from a
Okay.
regulator.
Okay. Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. So the first thing is, of course, the guidelines. As this is not something which I'm saying, but this is in the rules. But just to stress on this, guidelines, the caveats, limitations of disclosure should not
Absolutely.
be kind of limiting the responsibility of the valuer. And
Okay.
just to reassure the values, caveats, limitations, or disclosure, it is just putting things in perspective. For example, especially in solvency cases, in many cases you find the information is not there. So that is a kind of disclaimer we need to give to protect ourselves also. So that's
okay.
And the second part I would say is that whatever due diligence which the valuer has done, sometimes, for example, you are based on management's projections. But what due diligence have you done? So that needs to come out.
That's important. Okay.
Not accept information as it is. There may be challenges, but you have to, in your report, you have to state what are the kind of procedures, what are the kind of measures you have taken to verify the information which has been provided to you by the IP or the management. And the third part, of course, I think there is a general observation. As RVs, we must realize that we are a kind of select few. We are only 4,000 out of total number of registered valuers out of, say, I mean, it's estimate vary, but it's generally believed from 40,000 odd or so. So we are one of the select few. So whatever we do in our, in our mannerisms, in our approach, in the way we, in fact, for example, in the first review, you find there are various which I would call hygiene issues. What are hygiene issues? Presentation issues, defects in logic, defects in grammar. So these from a register value are not acceptable. And
absolutely.
just to dwell on this further, we have said in the valuation report, the first part is a background. So I would say that the valuer also has a duty to present a complete picture of what is the company about and what is the perspective. And this again broadly stems from the fact, in fact, to give again, and coming back to this,
yes, the evolution,
caveats, this thing. So one of the concerns here was that there were substantial differences between two valuation reports. What happens? What happens when IP gets two valuation reports which are substantially different? So he does the simplest of things. The code says third value, appoint a third value, take the two, my work is done. But the issue here is, of course, this is more on the IP side. But I'll come to what is the responsibility of the RV side. Is to see that why were there substantial differences between the two valuation. And that's why I think, this could possibly a fourth aspect. Fourth aspect is that on the valuation standards. Again, if you find in the peer review, you find that many cases valuation standards have not been quoted. In some cases, two different valuation standards have been, used in different parts of the report. Again, maybe these are hygiene issues, but actually this is a serious issue because valuation standards are extremely important. In fact, I would rather say I would say that put this ahead of the fourth. I would not put it as the fourth. I would say this is the third issue, which is that the use of an acceptable valuation standard. I would say this is the third important part. So first is limitations, convention, disclaimers.
Okay.
Two is investigation done by the registered valuer based on the information provided by him. And third is, of course, use of a consistent and acceptable valuation standard, because idea of valuation standard is to bring about consistency in a valuation report. We all know valuation always has a subjective element, but all things, all assumptions taken into account, there should not be major differences between two valuation reports, and that is what valuation standards aim to achieve. So that is why it's very important to take valuation standards, give the valuation standards, use a consistent valuation standards in the valuation.
So MPV, this question is to you. Do we mandate, well, it's not mandatory, of course, but do we say somewhere in the standards that if you are certifying a report, well, if you are churning out a valuation report, you should on your first page mention the valuation standard? Like, I don't know if you know, in the Institute of Internal Auditors, if we were to go through a quality program, it said that, you know, you are using this standard. Is that a requirement?
It's a mandatory requirement. It's a mandatory requirement. You have to specify which standards you have adopted in your valuation exercise.
Fantastic. Okay. All right. No, so I think back to you, MPV. I will just keep troubling you.
I think the 4 points were pretty well articulated. In fact, I would say that all 4 stand on the same level. You know, it's difficult to prioritize which one is important. No, it's just that you have to tell sequentially.
The only one thing that I've learned in the last 6 Sundays, MPV, is review of the assumptions is the heart of the valuation, which unfortunately for the past several years, people would have taken it as is where is basis based on management report, right? Which is fundamentally coming at the heart that you need to review it, you need to put time on it, validate it based on your experience, industry experience, whatever. And then of course you have to apply your methodology in terms of what you're doing. So I think that has really come out very well.
In fact, the other thing I'd like to extend, Anil, on that is what you said is right. Same point. Same point is how much of data the valuer is actually able to bring together to the valuation exercise, not just associated with the entity, but relating to the industry, comparable. How much of data he is able to get. I think that's where the game is all about, actually. Ms. Debjyoti, if I can come back to the topic on peer valuation.
Maybe we should encourage our valuers that if you become very good at valuation, maybe you'll become very good at stock market in the future. Fundamentally value.
I think valuers and the stock market guys are totally two different animals, and it's totally different.
Fundamentally, I disagree with you, Rajanji. But yes, practically, I agree with you that both the valuations run differently. Ideally, in an ideal world, it should run the same. But you're right.
Then you're talking about the saying in economics, like ceteris paribus, everything else remaining the same. I agree in this case, because markets are driven by factors which are beyond this thing.
But I'm saying fundamentally, I would love to debate this with you, because the market is driven with variables which are long thought of, and of course short-term and long-term variables, and they would have short-term and long-term experts. So anyway, let's not get into this today, because that's a very interesting topic.
But maybe we should debate
back to you, MPV.
We should debate. Mr. Debjyoti, coming back to peer review, in fact, I want to complement 2 things. One is the findings of peer review which have been published in very simple form. It's not been published like a huge document which actually puts off people. People don't feel like reading. It's not like it's very simple form. It has been brought in. And second, I like the consistency of publishing it every February. You had it in February 2020. You had it in February 21. I think a 1 week gap was there, but otherwise you're more or less there. Between the February 20 peer review report, where approximately about 31 observations were there, and in the February 21, where we had about 49 observations. What do you see as the what has changed between the two? There could be some areas where people have improved, some areas where people still continue to repeat the same mistakes. What are your thoughts on that? And on February 21, I want to also compliment and bring to attention of all the participants that there is 1 page dedicated fully for recommendations or suggestions. It's less than 3/4 page. I think that's a good Bible for people to take away from the peer review. Peer review is like experience of work done across so many valuers, brought in a very short document. It was 2 pages earlier. Now it is 7 pages, but still, if I remove all the empty spaces, it's largely 5 pages for people to read. So request your thoughts on that.
Sure. So let me just tell you that this February is not just by coincidence, it's by design. The idea is that we do the peer review throughout the year and we publish it near about the close to the financial year so that the RBs can have a guidance for the next financial year and they're able to implement whatever suggestions are there in the forthcoming year, evaluation report in the forthcoming year, so they can implement that. So that was the idea behind publishing it in February, because it takes some time to compile all the suggestions and bring out this paper. But then the idea is that from the next financial year, we can start with a clean slate. Now, as regards to observations between the two peer review reports, so one is that what I can say is that generally all the peer reviews were of the view that there has been an overall improvement. So that is, I think, everyone has been able to bring out clearly, and of course that is very, very heartening. Other issue which which brings some cheer to us is that what I earlier said about hygiene issues like error in spelling, lack of consistency, poor logic. So all those issues do not seem to be there in the second peer review. Now, one major difference, one major issue, in the second peer review is that on this caveats, limitations, and disclaimers. And now I think, if you permit, I'll give you the background of how this caveats, limitations, and disclaimers came about. So we did this national seminar on evaluation, and believe me, this was a very important event. It was attended by almost 800 values, and this was a physical event. So almost 800 values attended it. And one of the issues which came about is that these caveats, limitations, and disclaimers, and which, although it is there in the rules, but some of these caveats, in fact, one speaker spoke of the specific examples in which these have been used and which entirely defeat the objective of valuations under the code and under the rules. So the genesis was this feedback obtained during the National Seminar on Valuation, June 2019. And we started working on this. We did an extensive public consultation on this. And subsequently, after a great deal of public consultation and feedback from the RBOs, and this finally came about in September 2020. So the major, the change or the observations in this peer review of 2021 was this use of caveats, limitations, and disclaimers. And the heartening fact is that, yes, it has been taken cognizance, but what we need to further work on is the effective one, implementation, two, areas which are difficult to implement. So that's why I said that this is subject to further amendment. We got this feedback that there are some issues which need to be further tweaked. So further amendments need to be done so as to make them effective and capable of being implementation. So those areas we are working on, and one of the consequences, one of the decisions we took at the conclusion of this peer review is that this caveats, limitations, the awareness of caveats, limitations, and disclaimers would be one of the focus areas for the RBOs. They'll be doing numerous seminars on this, and we have also said this can also be included in the training which is conducted by the RBOs before they give the certificate of practice. So I think that's all from the peer review side, but There's just one observation, if you permit, or we can keep this later.
Sure, sure. So, Debjyoti, I just want to assure you on behalf of the Institute, and of course, I'm not formally part of ICAR, but it is our arm. On caveats, limitation, and disclaimers, I just want to tell you that when we started this Sunday series, we had none other than Rajan speaking on it, and that was the very first session we have done. And we have been doing across the country multiple programs on this topic, and people are appreciating the intent behind that particular guidelines. In fact, I have a few questions from the participants, Mr. Debjyoti. In fact, many of them are complimenting the way you are articulating. That's a general feedback. And there are few members who have commented that they have been a peer reviewer themselves and they have benefited immensely, as you rightly put up. So they have put that up in the chat box. I'll just pick up some 5-6 questions, and if it's okay with you, Mr. Debjyoti, a little rapid fire answering for this, because I'd like to get the maximum benefit of your knowledge in today's session. So one is the peer review application form requires tax audit report - NOS audited. I haven't understood, but for how many years this detail is required?
No, I'll not be able to comment on that. I think maybe Rajan would be.
Rajan or Sarika, any of you?
Sorry, what's the
Peer
question?
review application form requires tax audit report to be given. For how many years this detail is required?
No, we're talking about the historical, right? So I think I can very well go with when I'm doing any evaluation, I would just take a look at the last 2 years, at least the tax audit report, to figure out the unabsorbed losses or anything which is there, and seeing that they get captured in this sort of this thing. There's no point for me to go down 5-10 years if I was to perform a valuation, I would say. So any valuer who's performing any of this job, he will look at the position which exists on the valuation date in terms of losses and all that stuff. Okay. So I think that's the question which someone is asking.
Okay. Now, the next question is, are there any guidelines formulated for peer review? Is there a framework? Like, for example, within the institute, we have a peer review statement and we do the work according to that. So some thoughts on that, Mr. Debjyoti.
Sure. So if you see, the first peer review was a kind of learning experience. So we are just kind of finding a way. And the second peer review, which we did, was kind of developed on that. So on conclusion of this peer review, and when we realized the immense benefits of this, so we have advised all our RVOs to have a peer review policy, because as I said, RVOs are the kind of frontline regulators. So they are coordinating this. So that's why we have requested all the RVOs to have a peer review policy. And the peer review would be guided broadly by the terms of the peer review policy of the individual RVOs.
And there's one question which members have repeated. I would have liked to avoid it, but maybe they would like to get the benefit of your presence. What is the status of the draft valuers bill, and when is it expected to be a law? To be very honest, I would have avoided this question, but for the fact that many people have repeatedly asked it.
No issues at all. So draft valuers bill is an active consideration of the government.
Okay, appreciate it. Now, so as far as the peer review reports are concerned, Mr. Debjyoti, when we do year on year, I'm sure there are 2-3 areas which are improved. I would make a request that when the report is done, just more from a confidence building perspective and also showcasing the profession to the world at large, we can say that between the earlier report and this report, these are 3 areas where we found there's a substantial improvement. I think it also incentivizes people to go that particular path.
Absolutely. That's very, very well taken. And of course, at the very outset in this peer review report, in the second one, we have stated that, but then we could, make it more specific also, because, give the various areas where there has been peer review report. I think this has been compiled by ICAR, but maybe it's not come out in the peer review report very clearly. So definitely in the next peer review report, we'll definitely take this into account. And of course, it will be a good incentive for registered valuers. I Entirely agree with that. And it's a good suggestion. We'll definitely take it forward.
Sure. Rajan, if I'd like to, we have this 10 recommendations which have been added in the peer review report of 2021. While there are 49 observations, would you like to highlight some of those? Maybe if you want, I can put it up on the screen for you so that you could explain to the members the same.
Sure. If you could put that up, MPV, that I can address them.
So I somehow like the simplicity of this report. Actually, it's so beautifully drafted.
Yeah, this was very, like I said.
Compliments to us, sir.
Pardon?
Debajyoti sir already told ICARBO did it.
No, honestly.
I'm not sure the screen is visible.
No, it is visible. It's visible, APV.
Maybe you could just explain these to the members so that we are also meeting the goal of Mr. Debajyoti that we should disseminate knowledge for improvement. In fact, he's been such a senior banker himself, and he knows the importance of reaching out to people. Over to you, Rajan.
Thanks, MPV. Like what everyone alluded to earlier, we saw tremendous improvement in the two rounds of the peer review, and it's there. While we can put out the specifics, also it's there as a motherhood statement that we saw so much improvement from first time to the second time. Now coming on to some of these specific instances which were noticed in this thing. Now let's look at the first one. The first one talks about valuation report stated that since projections of price sensitive information, income approach has not been used. The confidential should not deter the value. I'm saying you can use that information, but you cannot provide that information because that's a forward-looking statement and that's based on the best estimate which the company may have provided to you now. And hence you've used that for your analysis and you're performing a DCF. But how can you say that forward-looking statement, because valuations are inherently based upon the historics as well as what the expectation of for the future are. So if a person says, I have not used projections in my analysis because it's price sensitive, I can't figure any logic of putting this statement over there.
Rajanji, sorry to interrupt. I think this is fundamentally important as this is the foundation. And I think you very well, we're very well done to bring it out as number one issue here. So in your experience, how many such issues you have seen across the peer review? I mean, are you saying that you've seen this a lot across reports?
No, this one came across one instance, but like it's, I won't know because this may be what I may have found out, what we may have found out, but there could be other RVOs, they would have been redoing it. So that compilation, but we don't know. But it's inherently or fundamentally going against the rational or principle evaluation.
Correct.
You can perfectly, like I said, you can put a disclaimer and everything over there that I cannot share it, but you have worked on those numbers projection. You've done your founding or you've done your analysis, which you presented to the independent directors and everyone on the board of the company over there. They are also there as a regulator and protector of others' rights. So all that has been done, but I can't say that I have not used it. I may say that the results which I may have got from the projection were were inconsistent with my finding using some other approach. So I've discarded them. I can say that, but I can't say I have not used it. Second question, a lot of people, I think we noticed in a couple of situations where someone had put in a generic comment like the discount rate has been given to me by the management. We said like, you can't do that, The basis on which the discount rate has been put in, worked out should be provided. Now, in that discount rate working, what a person might say is a couple of things, which is the risk-free and all that stuff. And there is an alpha or a delta, which an individual applies. And that's that individual judgment. That is something which you can't prescribe, right? That's the experience of a person taking into account the projections which are coming in, what the business environment is, and all those things. A person applies that thing, and valuation, as we all agree, is at a particular point of time. It's not, it doesn't hold constant for even this thing, and especially what we're seeing in last 1.5, 2 years, the volatility has only gone up. again, explicit declaration regarding compliance with valuation standards. This was noticed. So what is there is people should talk that which valuation standards they have accepted, whether they're going into the specifics or not, that's not that mandatory. But the important thing is, as a chartered accountant, at least I'm required to put that I have followed the ICAI prescribed valuation standards, which are relevant for this thing. Like when we carry out even an audit, right? We don't write each and every accounting standard, but we are required to follow those accounting standards. And then a mention or a confirmation around that is warranted in that sense. People were not giving out either their the number, the membership number, so the recognition, and I think ICAI handled it very well in the form of a UDI, and now whether going forward that gets copied here, let's see how it works.
I think number six is interesting. While mentioning the purpose of valuation, valuers should reproduce these sections and related provisions. If you could draw light on this, because I think
someone felt it now. It's like if you're doing a merger or a swap ratio, what is the purpose of valuation, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So if it is going to be filed with the court, now it's in the context of that section which we are doing it. But generally what happens is, at least in a practical sense, a particular valuation could be used for when a management engages a valuer, it might say that we might go through a quote scheme, we might do a reduction ourselves, or we might do a buyback. So in the letter, engagement letter, it can be for internal decision making, but for the purpose of such some things. Now, whether the specific section is mentioned out or not is eventually at the end of it. I think the valuer should clearly define what is the purpose for which he has done the valuation. That should clearly come out. Now, whether it's for a buyback, whether it's for a further issue of shares, whether he mentions a relevant section or not, but at least the purpose should come out clearly, because if it could be used for a couple of purposes, so defining a particular section or a law around that, or that may or may not. But like typically, if you're doing a valuation for, say, income tax, we always write that this valuation is being done under rule this of that. That is relevant over there, because that's a very rule-driven valuation.
Absolutely.
Whereas when you're doing a valuation for a Companies Act, it is not a rule-driven valuation, but it's the science around it is the methodologies and everything are prescribed, but art around it is how you are going to apply them. So that's the key thing over there.
So just to add on one point, this peer review report is for all the 3 asset classes.
Yeah.
So not only income tax, like we are discussing, because we are in financials or securities asset class, that is why we are discussing this point. But this entire report is for all the asset classes and by all the RVs.
And this is a compilation of all the RVOs findings, all the peer reviewers findings across RVOs. So from that perspective, now
fantastic. So I think I think the source of data, of course, is a given. I mean, are we saying that it really helps, and is it closer to being mandatory that the source of data that you're using should ideally be put in the report, because that actually also gives a direction to the reader and also protects you as a registered valuer in the future, saying that this is what I've used, this has come from some credible source, and that is how I am putting my assumptions and validating them. Correct?
Yes, because see, the other key thing over here is, as a valuer, I am relying on what the historical data, or even the market-based information from some of those databases, which could be a Bloomberg, Capital Line, even the Bombay Stock Exchange when I'm doing the peer review, right? Or I could be using even the annual reports of the peers to dig out the data which I'm applying and all that stuff. So source of that data is very important. When I'm taking out even the discount rate I'm working out on, I should know which database I've used and where this thing I've done. When I'm working out the comparables, how did I go about doing it? Also, hence disclosure of all those databases or sources of information. And then the important thing is the procedures which I've applied to that information which I've got. That should clearly come out, and that's the whole purpose of this. Because a lot of time.
So are you saying sorry about this, but are you saying that how we do in audit, for example, you need to put out some procedures that we've applied to test the assumptions, or procedures that we have applied to validate, review assumptions, is something that we should probably detail it in a report in some format to say that, look, I have gone to this extent and I have validated this. Is that what?
No, what I typically, I can talk about myself or the others, like, what should be done is what all information which you got first, that the sources of information and what all information which you got is one bit of it. That should clearly get articulated. The second thing around it, what procedures you performed on it, which is an analysis of the projection and everything which has gone. Do you believe now your analysis, if it has thrown some absurd results, then you should not agree on to that, right? And you should clearly do that. So you do need to perform your analysis on whatever information which has come to you, which will be review of the numbers, the further analysis thereof on it. Any if they're showing any absurdities, then you should be taking a conscious call whether you want to go ahead or not go ahead, or what your view is. And so you should just articulate, at least list out, right, that what all work which you performed on that. I have reviewed the projection, I have analyzed the projection. Then in certain cases, again, it all comes down to what is the purpose of valuation. Typically what may happen is a person may do even the report which may come out in the public domain could be a concise report, but to the board or to the independent director which are constituting it, because like I said, in a listed company, it becomes very sensitive what information you're going to be throwing out, because one is it's sensitive in terms of what information should be out, the plans of the company, future investors, you're opening yourself up for this thing. The second is even competitors, they can misuse that information. So you can't just put out everything which is there, because that lays out even a company's plans would come out suddenly in public domain, the business plan. So one needs to balance out all those things. Now, all that analysis and work, or a detailed thing, that it is quite possible that may have got carried out when the board presentations have happened. Independent directors have reviewed it, and let's not forget, in certain cases, that the business plans and all that for any good corporate, any good company which has got a good corporate governance mechanism and all that, always the long range plans and everything are approved by the board, and they've gone through all that. So it is not that they're getting created at that time to give a valuation. So all those things a person does need to keep in mind when he's doing a valuation. One does need to keep in mind what is the prevailing circumstances or scenarios are.
No, I understand. I think this is fairly well brought out. I think MPV, is there any tricky issue in the next page?
No, nothing, Anil. In fact, I'd just like to go back to Debjyoti. Thanks, Rajan, for walking us through this. Debjyoti, you actually mentioned on the last point 10. You already mentioned in your initial observations that we need to look at a fee structure for reviewer and all, so which I agree. On the remaining 9 points, are there any quick thoughts from your end before I can come to you for one last question?
No, I have just no thoughts. This is perfectly brought out. And I think there was one observation I do remember. Maybe it's coming up somewhere in this note. This, and this is we observed in the second peer review. It's about this significance of the dates.
Yeah.
Dates are extremely important. So they are basically.
Yeah, it's there in the.
That's come up in the findings, Debjyoti.
Findings.
In the finding.
Sure.
Because people were confusing themselves with the appointment date, the date of valuation. The third is the signing of the report. There was this thing, and these were like what you call, rightly said, the hygiene issues.
Yeah. No, why it's important now? Because see what has happened. Because in this present context of COVID, many things could change, and so if you have not got the dates right, so you could land yourself in trouble. So that is why this, this valuation date is extremely important. All 3 dates, So that should be extremely important, exception in the context
MPV, I'm not sure if you are able to quickly scroll through from the observations, and you may want to maybe highlight 1 or 2 which.
Sure.
Okay. I'm saying in the interest of, telling members that, look, this is what we have seen most of the time, and this is what we need to get right. I don't know if there's anything that you would want to scroll through.
No, I think Ms. Debjyoti rightly brought this point on date. Ms. Debjyoti, just for information, last Sunday or the previous Sunday, we had a 1.5 hour session on dating with dates. So, which was the valuation date, valuation report date, appointment date, subsequent events. So, we had a good 1.5 hour session and lots of questions which came from members. I'm not sure if Sarika has shared with you, Mrs. Debjyoti.
Yeah, she has shared all of them, but honestly, I've not had time to go through them, but she has dutifully shared it with me.
Yeah, the last seven of the last 10 Sunday series, we had almost about 1,000 questions which came up. So we drafted answers for those and released it on the CA day on 1st of July. I'm sure she would have shared, otherwise I would request her to share.
Shared already.
Okay. So at this point number 11 is what you were mentioning, which is the main report. It's the main report. And Anil,
I think number 7 MPV. I thought number 7 is there is a general lack of understanding of concepts and definitions. So I'm not sure this is like a motherhood statement. So maybe if Rajan or Chaudhary, anybody would want to just stress on what is it that we are expecting from the registered valuers, and there's something that maybe as an institute we can do to make sure that their awareness is there.
My take on this was, I think people were initially not very conversant with the concept of fair value, market value, relevance, liquidation value, orderly liquidation, and all that. That's where a lot of people were getting confused, and people were, because initially, if you just take a look at when the insolvency profession itself came out, it talked whether the valuation is a liquidation valuation, and a lot of people were confusing themselves with the going concern valuation, because that was actually one of the biggest challenges which and Debjyoti will be right to talk about it as a banker. Suddenly people were saying, how is it possible? We just got this valuation 6 months back and everything was worth so much, and today you're giving us a liquidation valuation, without realizing there's a fundamental difference between the valuation which you may have got 3 or 6 months back, which was basically talking about a going concern valuation if the environment improves, and this is it. Whereas this time, now you're talking about a floor valuation which is being done, and that's how the rules were also changed subsequently, where IBBI and others, they put in this thing that we should also have a going concern valuation, and I still recollect the first time when we did it. Because it hit the pink dailies as a press, XYZ has revised the valuation by so much to so much, not realizing one is a liquidation valuation, the other is
fantastic. So I think we, in one of our Sundays, I think we debated on the scope very well, I think, Rajanji, and I think you also brought it out as one important element that, what are you doing this valuation for? And that becomes very, very important. Sometimes the minority valuation could be more than a majority valuation, all of that, I think. So I think the purpose, what you're trying to highlight is important. So what you're saying is basic concepts around that were not very clearly brought out, and that's something that our expectation is in and around the reports, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And maybe I think you were trying to highlight this reason for not considering.
Just to demonstrate that I'm a good vice chairman to you.
Absolutely, you are the teacher amongst the teachers, my friend.
This point number 15, and I'm very happy Mr. Debjyoti drew our attention to this. This item number 15 also I find is an important one, particularly the second bullet point. Mr. Debjyoti or Rajan, would you like to add something on that?
Yeah, so I think that this is something which in the first session, if you recollect, of valuation, when they're talking about the caveats and everything, it's been going on, and we've been blabbering over it, or we've been repeating it. That's the most important thing, reasons for not considering certain methodologies. People tend to we just spoke about the point number 1 on the recommendation, where a person says, I'm not using this projection because that's price sensitive. It goes against the fundamental logic of carrying out evaluation then, right? If a person is not using a certain methodology, which could be as simple as saying that I cannot find a real peer set, a real comparable of this, because especially in a country like India, you can have that situation where we have companies which are diverse or conglomerates, and finding an apple to apple comparison may not work, and trying to apply a multiple of a consumer durable to a company which is into industrial manufacturing just because 5% of its revenues come from that can give you very erroneous results. So just a simple statement around that, why I'm not doing it, or why am I giving a higher weightage or higher reliance onto a methodology? It's again a judgment of a value or an experience which he has, that he applies it. But the important thing is, it should be mentioned why a particular methodology is not being used. For a minute, let's leave the insolvency valuations out. NAV in today's scenario is not that relevant. This thing, however, we as accountants, we all know that when COVID hit us last year in March 20, when suddenly this thing happened and the markets went down, a lot of companies had a situation where their share price were trading below the book value, and you had to get into an impairment testing exercise over there.
Correct. Absolutely. I think just before you go to 33 MPV, I think there's just one more on this page quickly. Just scroll up a little bit about the cash flow. Very specifically, this is coming out. Yeah, the 16, point number 16. Sorry for that. Yeah.
I think this is a mistake, Anil, whoever has done it. So there is no two doubts about that in the report.
Right. Okay, perfect. All right.
Because if he's doing the valuation of 15th February 20, he cannot take full year projections of this thing. What he should have ideally taken is the cut-off balance sheet as on 15th February or whatever, because it would have already accounted for the cash which he would have made till now. That would have covered the cash position, and then he should have taken.
He's actually accounting for cash which is on 20.
Which has already come in, which has already
March.
Could have come in,
Yeah.
which has already come in, a part of it. So he could have ideally done 1.5 months discounting for the first one, and then the years thereafter, while taking the position on this thing. Yeah. So.
Correct. All right. Cool. So let's move to the. Yeah, you were at 33. Correct. Yes. Any thoughts on liquidation discount?
See, honestly, this is again.
This must be pretty rampant in IBC cases. The quantum of liquidation discount, because it eventually affects the banking system in terms of haircut and all.
Basis, I can talk about from my this thing wherever it is, right? Unfortunately, in India, we do not have a ready market or the data available to that extent where you can do a comparison. I can talk about, say, a US or any other place. You know, for a price for the second-hand machinery, even a thing like an aircraft, right?
Yeah.
You can go onto a site and check out this much old aircraft which has done so many hours, and you can get a range within which that aircraft you can buy, and obviously you will need to make adjustment taking into account the condition, overhauling, last done, whatever flying hours done. Those are certain. It's like a hotel in Delhi versus like a Chanakya Puri hotel, like a Leela, could be different from a hotel at AeroCity, right? Now the land prices could be simple, but you may need to make adjustment taking into account the local factors which are there. So that is, unfortunately, in India, you do not have that precise data available. Right. I'll be very honest about it.
So what would you suggest our members to do in this cases where I think it is best for him to, of course, it's a judgmental call, and that's where experience plays an important role in valuation. And one should clearly articulate whatever data that one is choosing to use, or based on maybe data not being available in the Indian scenario, this is the kind of discount that one has applied based on his experience and judgment. Is that a fair thing to do?
What I understand is, and this typically is happening in the case of liquidation valuations, if you see, that is what they've said. And at least wherever I work with the tangible asset, the plant and machinery, the land is still relatively easier to work out the discounting. For plant and machinery, typically, at least a lot of experienced valuers with whom I have worked, they seem to have an idea, or they keep a database by themselves on say second-hand boiler, at what price it got sold and all that stuff, basis their previous valuations which they may have done, or the market intelligence which they may have done, and they tend to use that data. Obviously, another way to do it is by what is at the end of it, no one is going to pay me if it is more than what it will cost him to recreate and put the same thing in the same condition. So people try to do that, but however, it's like in US market, you've got those Ibbotson and all that, small stock premium and all those adequate studies.
Right.
But in India, unfortunately, we don't have it. Neither are we at that stage because.
So Rajanji, I just wanted to be ambitious here, and maybe I'll request Sarika that if you could, we could chat offline about this, trying and creating a repository of all of these white spaces or gray spaces, as we may want to call it, and getting a little more technical into the valuation aspects, helping our members to maybe identify sources of data, if available anywhere internationally, or maybe from the institute, we could spend some money and get that at one place. So maybe we could use Rajanji's good office to understand those critical aspects that, he would have, or of course, any other experts that we would have amongst ourselves. So I think that might be important, because I think another thing that I read there is liquidation value, sometimes misused for lower bids under bankruptcy insolvency auctions. And this would, of course, happen in the course of the work that we do. So let's try and see if we can figure that out. Yeah, but MPV, I think you were highlighting.
I'd just like to add one point on this
Yes, sir,
liquidation discount. We've seen a few instances where this liquidation discount has been applied very indiscriminately across many CDs which are undergoing liquidation. Whereas in those cases, it is found that the company is actually a going concern. So that's why, if this is applied to a going concern, it warrants a lot of caution. Whenever, because it should not be applied indiscriminately for any company just because it's undergoing liquidation proceedings under IBC. Because even in liquidation proceedings, many companies are, have the status of a going concern.
No,
So
fantastic. I think you're highlighting this is very important, because all our valuers who are and prospective valuers who are seeing us today need to understand that if, especially the reports under IBC, they could be challenged, and these are always tricky. And I think we should err on the side of being conservative and caution rather than being aggressive here. So I think this is something that all of us should be aware about. So no, thank you, sir. I think you really highlighted an important aspect here.
Yeah, thank you. And one more issue, I think we just quickly skipped that issue about this, about this letters given by IPs. So this is one issue which is coming up. And I think as far as I know, I can see that
35, number 35. MPV.
Yeah. So that is very important. Actually, we need to also sensitize RPs when they are giving arrangement letters, the engagement letters. As we had asked all the RVOs to give a model engagement letter on the websites. I think it is there for ICAI RVO and most other RVOs. So that is very important. And the second part of it is that of conflict of interest. Now, of course, broad areas of conflict of interest, these are part of best practices. But other than that, the code gives certain prohibitions. So certain, assignments we cannot take up. So these are there in our regulations. But we often find that these engagement letters are not there. In these engagement letters, such declarations are not there. So it is better that our RVs are aware of this, and because see, although it is governed under the rules, but please remember that registered valuer is provided under the regulations. The code does not define registered valuers, but the regulations under the code provide for a registered valuer. So if a registered valuer is found to be in conflict of these regulations, so he could be subject to action. So please, besides the usual best practices of conflict of interest, please especially cover and be aware of what are the areas where there is a strict prohibition under the regulations.
So I think MPV, sorry for this again. I think this is a very interesting topic. I was the chairman of IBC, I think last year, and we discussed conflict of interest there as well. And people all across the country have quickly started to create loosely held or tightly held networks. And what really constitutes a conflict is, of course, a question mark around the IBC, the insolvency practitioners, as well as the registered valuers. So I think this is something that we may want to pick it up in one of our discussions as to what is this Chinese line that one needs to draw. Just because I happen to know somebody and loosely created network doesn't really mean conflict. But maybe if I continue to do the same work with the same guy over a period of a year, maybe 10 or 20 or 30 engagements, does it eventually lead to conflict of interest? And these are some good areas that, I don't know, maybe you
Sure.
think if it's interesting, we should. Yeah.
Ms. Jebjot, just last one quick yes/no before I go to one last question from you. This 42 first bullet point in this report, appointment of single valuer representing one class of asset as an umbrella valuation engagement involving valuations under other classes. I guess it's a strict no. It's a strict no. If it's a strict no, I think the respective registered valuer organizations have to issue an announcement to its members to avoid this. Is that understanding correct?
Absolutely. But then
Yeah.
see what happens is any corporate data will have different asset classes. And the rules do provide for this, that any asset, registered value take inputs from the respective, value of the respective asset class while compiling this report. So those provisions need to be complied with. I mean, there is some area we could, which the rules could do with some further improvement. So in that, because there, what happens is that, issues of liability and other things come about. But as of now, it is there. You can do for the other asset class only if you are taking inputs from the registered value of that asset class, and that is also acknowledged in the valuation report. So that's how things stand.
Yeah, exactly. I was going to come to that, MPB. I think let's take the example of if you're doing a valuation of a company and there's also a tangible asset piece. You can.
That's understood, Rajan. Rajan, I think this observation here is a different one. Here, the observation seems to be a different one. Like, for example, somebody wants to do valuation for PPE for revaluation of fixed assets.
That cannot be done by a SFA. That is very clear.
Exactly. So I think those are umbrella assignments which cannot be prohibited. If I am valuing a business, and in that, if I am taking a valuation report,
exactly.
But I think this first bullet point, some people might.
They might. Yeah, but the larger issue which I want this panel to discuss is what the IPs are doing is where there are 3 asset classes, and he will be appointing, say, 6 or maybe actually 9 different valuers for valuation of all these various asset classes. But at the end of it, the IP needs a single value. So, so one registered valuer does this, combined valuation, and he will acknowledge the valuation done by all the registered valuers. So that is the general practice. So, I would like this.
But would that be technically right, Chaudhary Sahab? Because my competence may not be to do a particular kind of valuation. So,
yeah, but the challenge is that a corporate debtor will have 3 different types of assets,
right?
And the IP will need a single valuation number.
Yeah, exactly.
So how do you do that?
No, you need
and
to.
The rules,
You need to engage you need to engage the relevant experts, but at the end of it, this is basis my discussions at IBB and various fora, and Mr. Chaudhary can confirm that is that at the end of it, ultimate responsibility will lie with the person who's put his final chop on the final report. He can use the resources.
That Rajanji would culminate
exactly.
into when you're valuing a particular instrument, right? Eventually, finally. So when somebody is valuing a business, how would that work?
But let's take this thing that if you're valuing a business in a company, right? You could be valuing tangible assets also as a part of it, or realizable value out of it. Also, how do you do that? Final report is going under my name, then I owe responsibility for that. I am relying on the work of another expert. And that's why if you recollect in the guidelines and all that, when we're talking about caveats and all that, at least I've been emphasizing it day in, day out. Please familiarize yourself also with the caveat limitations of other asset class, because you are a user of those, or you are a user or relying on those reports when you are putting your final chop onto this thing. So you should question them as someone will question you about your caveats in a SFA class.
So what happens in a liquid? I mean, I'm sorry, I'm eating away some time. We have already crossed 12:35. But what happens in case of a pure liquidation? do I still have an umbrella? Do I still have a single valuation?
At least for the entire business, we've been giving a total value which will include breakup of tangible, intangibles.
All of these
or
that
the
you
other
total
stuff.
up, all of these that you total up, and then you
you take the balance sheet basically in a liquidation value. First you take the balance sheet.
But fundamentally there is no business, no. I am just taking the assets and I am selling it.
That's if you reached a stage that there is no business left, then you're
absolutely. I'm saying in a valuation methodology where there is no business and I'm just distributing the assets.
Then you're just basically trying to get a realizable value of each.
That means I will have 9 valuation reports if the business is complex, correct?
Yeah.
That means the IP will have to go through each valuation report and make sure that he kind of distributes it based on whatever he has, and he has to do the total.
See, the bankers at the end of it are interested in what percentage they get out on the basis of the total. They are not going to be obviously because they are not interested in each. Correct. Land is going to get me this thing. They are interested in total because they're trying to set up. If they're trying to do a settlement, also they want to know the floor below which they should not realize, or that's their walk away, right?
Okay. So there is no. We are on the same page. We are on the same page in this understanding. Am I right, Chaudhary? My understanding is wrong.
Absolutely. So that's the point I was, coming to, and Rajanji, of course, has stated what is there in the rules, but the issue is that correct? Because essentially you're taking liability for an area which is where you may not have domain expertise.
Correct.
But as of now, that is what is there. And that is also practical necessity because the IP will need a single value.
Okay.
Maybe Anil, maybe one of the meetings we can deliberate this in the Valuation Standards Board. So
no, absolutely. I think a couple of very interesting pointers in this discussion, and of course we keep learning. So I'm improving my valuation, Professor MPB. Incremental improvement every Sunday. And I hope that this lasts longer. These kind of interactions last a little longer in the mind rather than taking a chalk and a blackboard. So thank you for taking us through this.
No, it was excellent. Ms. Debjyoti, thanks a lot for your time and sharing your thoughts. In fact, I have personally known you as somebody who is so very pragmatic. I'm sure all the listeners also have got the same understanding. Any concluding thoughts from you before I can hand it over back to Chairman to close?
Thank you so much, because this is one area which I'm very passionate about, and I'm grateful you are giving me this opportunity. So what I would say is that somehow the role of the registered valuer is not somewhat acknowledged. Our IPs have achieved great successes under the code, but somehow the role of the registered valuer is not acknowledged. And let us remember that this registered valuer concept was brought in mainly because that is the valuation is what makes a difference between a company having a resolution plan, having a resolution applicant, and rather than going into liquidation. So, but somehow this role of the registered valuer is not acknowledged. So there are two dimensions to it. One is we have asked the ICI RVO and all RVOs to come out with the success stories. Please do publish success stories. Your other parent organization, IIIP, has already published these various success stories. And if you read it, they are really gripping accounts, the kind of challenges the IPs had to face, and still they have come out successful. So please read these accounts. And I'm very sure that these success stories would not have been possible without the support of the registered valuer. So please do publish success stories. Second, my urge to all the registered valuers who have tuned in to this event is, please remember, a corporate insolvency resolution process is an orchestra where everybody has to play his part. Now, we have very instances where saying registered valuer is saying, there's a kind of passing the buck. IP says, I have to appoint within 7 days. I have appointed, finished, done. RV says, you have appointed, your arranging letter is not proper. You have not given any information. I don't have permission, pass the buck back. No, both have to work together. It is an orchestra. If both work in unison, only then, we can have success, we can have objective, we can achieve the objectives by which these rules were notified. So my request to all our registered valuers, let us work together and make these rules and the code a success. And of course, we have many future plans for this. We want to make this registered valuer a profession in itself. So, we have the draft valuers bills and other things are there. So idea is to make it's a profession, and with profession comes also responsibility and accountability. So let us be prepared for that and let us work towards that. And thank you for having me here.
Yes, so I think pleasure is ours, sir. It's been fantastic to have you here. And of course, you sharing our thoughts with all our viewers today. Again, it's always interesting and fantastic to have Rajan ji on board in any discussions that we have had so far. So it's always very, very interesting. And we would, of course, trouble you, Chaudhary ji, again, and also Rajan ji, to make sure that we have a lively discussion and debate. And sometimes, MPV, I would request you to throw out topics of discussion where our thoughts are different, to come and evolve at a good mechanism where we come to a understanding, or people understand the fundamentals behind what goes in where. So I think this has been interesting again. Peer review, of course, is very, very important, and I'm sure we would derive and all valuers would derive a lot of benefit from this as we evolve into a mature profession and create credibility both for ourselves as well as for the regulator. So thank you once again. I would like to hand it over to Sarika to do the formal summary and the thank yous, and of course then we will take this forward again.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. First of all, I would like to thank Anil Bhandari sir for thinking about this topic. And the moment this topic came in mind, the first name which came in mind was Debajyoti Ray Chaudhary sir. Because this subject is very close to his heart. We initiated workshop in 2020 with his thoughts only. So it is a collaborative effort. Both the workshops were conducted by ICAI-RVO in association with IBA, where all the RVOs had actively participated. Inputs came from all the RVOs because they also did a peer review of the reports. We made a compilation, but first of all, I would also like to share that when the first concept paper came, there we have also mentioned what kind of report has to be there, what shall be the content of the engagement letter, what are the expectations, and then the findings. This year, continuing with that, because already we captured what are the requirements, what a regulator wants from the valuers. This time we only had these findings. So humble request as ICAI as well as ICAI-RVO, and we have CGM IBBI, please go through these findings of the peer review reports so that in future these kind of mistakes are not there. We will also be conducting more and more sessions, and I would also like to thank Debajyoti Ray Chaudhary sir for accepting this invitation and come and take the session for more than 90 minutes, where we were like whether we will be able to even go through for 60 minutes or not. Then Rajan sir, who is also always available for ICAI as well as RVO. So he does not differentiate between both. Whenever you call him, he will say, "Aana hai kya? Okay, I will come." That's it. So Rakesh Sehgal sir also, who is part of ICAI-RVO as well as ICAI. Thank you so much, all the viewers who have come. We have published all our ATQs, valuation ATQs of 6 weeks, which are available on ICAI website as well as ICAI-RVO website under What's New section. We have also published a book called Valuation Professional Insight Series 6. So you may kindly go through all this and enrich your knowledge. We'll come next week to share our knowledge and the experience of this speaker. Thank you so much, everyone, to be part of this.
Thank
you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.